when their only heavy artillery piece, their sole hope of breaking a German siege, was immobilized and doomed to capture. What did they do? This is the story of desperation, ingenuity, and a machine pushed far beyond its limits. A story not of grand armies clashing, but of a handful of men, a broken gun, and a simple jeep. The date is January 22nd, 1945. The location, the shattered, snow-blanketed forests near the Belgian town of St. Vith. The unit, Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, U.S. Army. They are attached to the 7th Armored Division. Survivors of the brutal Battle of the Bulge, now pushing back into the The temperature is 17 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground is iron-hard frozen, covered in a foot of snow, and for one gun crew, time is running out. To understand the sheer impossibility of their task, we must first understand the tools of their trade, and the imbalance between them. The American M2A1 105mm howitzer, a masterpiece of mobile firepower. It could hurl a 33-pound high-explosive shell over 7 miles. In the broken terrain of the Ardennes, it was often the only thing that could reach enemy positions hidden behind ridges and in dense woods. But it was heavy, over 2 tons of steel and machinery. Its prescribed mover was the mighty M5 high-speed tractor, a fully tracked dedicated vehicle, or, at a pinch, a 2.5-ton truck, a deuce and a half. It was never, under any circumstances in the manual, meant to be towed by a jeep. And then, the jeep, the Willy Zemby. The iconic, quarter-ton, 4-wheel drive workhorse of the American military. It could carry 4 men, or 1,000 pounds of cargo. It was agile, reliable, and tough, but its engine produced just 60 horsepower. It weighed little over a ton itself. To ask it to tow a 105mm howitzer was, on paper, a mechanical absurdity. It was like asking a thoroughbred racehorse to pull a loaded freight car. The men of Battery B knew this. They were artillerymen, not mechanics. Their world was one of trajectories, powder charges, and forward observers. Their commander, a young, weary captain named James H. Ford, had one priority: keep the guns moving. The 7th Armored was advancing, albeit slowly, against a stiffening German rearguard. St. Vith, a vital road junction, had been retaken, but the Germans were fighting for every inch of the frozen pine forest. Captain Ford's battery provided crucial, indirect fire, shelling crossroads, suspected mortar positions, and pockets of resistance identified by infantry scouts. But this was a pursuit over broken ground. Roads were icy death traps for heavy vehicles. Fields were frozen bogs, and the dedicated M5 tractors were in short supply, often bogged down themselves or allocated to larger units. Battery B was making do. For the past 2 days, they had been using a deuce and a half to move their howitzers from one firing position to the next. It was slow, arduous work, and on the morning of the 22nd, as they prepared to displace forward again to support a planned infantry company attack on a key wooded ridge known as Hill 5, their fragile system broke down. The problem began at 083. 0 hours, the deuce and a half, its engine overworked and oil-starved in the bitter cold, through a rod. A catastrophic engine failure. It was now nothing more than a bulky, immobile roadblock. The other 3 guns were hooked up to their assigned vehicles, 2 other trucks, and one of the battalion SFU tractors. They had to move. The firing schedule for the attack on Hill 526 was set. Infantrymen from the 23rd Armored Infantry Battalion were counting on that preparatory bombardment to soften up entrenched German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers known to be defending the slope. But gun number 4, serial number 80,976, was stranded. Its crew of 8, led by Sergeant Frank Kelso, a 24-year-old from Ohio, stood around their massive charge, breath fogging in the air, faces etched with frustration and growing concern. They tried everything. They attempted to manhandle the howitzer. On flat, hard ground, with a full crew, it was possible to move it short distances by sheer muscle. But here, on the edge of a forest track, the wheels were half sunk in frozen mud and snow. It wouldn't budge. Captain Ford arrived, his jeep skidding to a halt. He assessed the situation with a grimace. "Sergeant Kelso, what are my options?" "Sir, the prime mover is finished. We can't push it. The ground's too soft underneath the crust. We'd need another deuce, or the other tractor." Ford checked his watch. 900. The preparatory bombardment was scheduled for 1100. The battery's new firing position was 2 miles away, through a winding, icy forest trail. The other guns were already en route. He got on his radio. The news was bad. No spare heavy vehicles were available. Battalion logistics was stretched to the breaking point. The advice, though unspoken, was clear. Disable the gun, remove the breech block, and evacuate the crew. Destroy it. If the enemy got too close, it was a standard, heartbreaking procedure. Lose the tool, save the men. But Captain Ford looked at Hill 526 on his map. Intelligence suggested at least 2 MG-42 machine gun nests and a pack 40 tank gun dug in on that ridge. Without the suppressing fire from all 4 howitzers, the infantry attack would be a bloodbath. He also knew the rules of the pursuit. Stopping meant losing momentum. Losing momentum meant giving the Germans time to dig in deeper. The thought of abandoning a perfectly good howitzer to be potentially captured or destroyed stuck in his craw. His eyes drifted from the immobilized howitzer to his own vehicle. The jeep, idling, roughly, its low hum a stark contrast to the silent bulk of the 105 millimeters. "Sergeant," Ford said, his voice low. "What about the jeep?" Kelso stared, thinking he'd misheard. "The jeep, sir. You mean to carry the crew out?" "We can do that. But the gun, no." "Sergeant." To tow the gun. The crew exchanged glances. It was madness. The jeep's pintle hook, the towing point, was a small, forged piece of steel designed for a light trailer, maybe a single-axle ammunition cart. The howitzer's lunette, the towing ring, was massive in comparison, even if they could physically connect them. The weight ratio was all wrong. The jeep's brakes would be useless. On any slop, the howitzer would push the jeep like a toy. The differential, the axles known of it, was engineered for that strain. But Captain Ford was not just suggesting, he was ordering. "We have an hour and 40 minutes. Sergeant, we either get this gun to position Alpha 7, or we write off a lot of good infantrymen. Figure it out. Use every strap, every chain, every prayer you've got." The next 45 minutes were a blur of desperate improvisation. The crew became mechanics. They found spare cargo straps, heavy duty, canvas and nylon webbing. They had a length of stout logging chain in the jeep's toolkit. The key, understood by Corporal Leohandi Andretti, a former farm boy from Wisconsin, was distribution of force. They couldn't just hook the chain to the pintle. It would snap or bend instantly. Instead, they created a makeshift harness. They looped the heavy cargo straps around the jeep's rear frame, forward of the axles, distributing the pull across the vehicle's chassis. To these straps, they connected the chain. To the chain, they finally connected the howitzer's lunette. It was a Rube Goldberg configuration of webbing and steel. They secured everything with shackles and knots they prayed would hold. Meanwhile, the sounds of war were getting closer. At 10:15, sporadic small arms fire echoed from the direction of Hill 526. The infantry was beginning its march. The promised artillery preparation was now not just a matter of tactics, but of urgent, life-saving necessity. Sergeant Kelso took the driver's seat of the jeep. Captain Ford rode shotgun, map in hand. The rest of the gun crew would walk alongside, ready to chock the howitzer's wheels with stones and wooden blocks at a moment's notice. They would be the jeep's brakes, the gun's anchors. Kelso looked back at the rig, the jeep, squatting under the strain of the tightened straps. The massive, muddy howitzer, looming behind it. The chain and webbing looked terrifyingly frail. "All right, son," Captain Ford said, his voice calm but tense. "Easy on the clutch. First gear only. We're not winning any races." Kelso took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. He released the clutch and pressed the accelerator. For the first 50 yards, it worked. The howitzer's wheels, freed from the frozen ruts by the Jeep's steady pull, began to turn. A collective, hesitant hope rose among the crew walking alongside. They moved at a walking pace, maybe 2 miles per hour. The forest trail was narrow, pockmarked with shell craters filled with icy water, and littered with broken branches. Then they hit the first incline. A gentle slope, no more than a 5-degree grade. The Jeep's engine, screaming in protest, began to bog down. The tires, with their minimal tread designed for hardpack, scrabbled for purchase on the icy pine needles and snow. They started to spin. The howitzer, sensing weakness, seemed to pull backward. The straps and chain went taut with a sound like a ship's rigging in a storm. "Chocks! Now!" Kelso yelled. The crew threw wooden blocks behind the howitzer's massive rubber tires. The gun stopped rolling back. The Jeep, relieved of the load, lurched forward a few inches. They were stuck in a cycle of Lurkan-Chok, gaining perhaps a foot with every agonizing sequence. It was untenable. At Tisrate, they would reach the firing position sometime next week. Worse, the noise was catastrophic. The screaming engine, the yelling men, the clanking of the chain. It was a beacon. At 10:40, just as they reached a slightly wider section of the trail, the first mortar round landed, humph. It was a German 81mm, landing 30 yards to their right, showering them with frozen dirt and shrapnel. The Folsham-Dronhill 526 had either heard them or had Ford observers in the trees. "They've got our range," Captain Ford shouted. "We cannot stop here." "Kelso! Get us to that def—" He pointed ahead to a dip in the trail, where the ground fell away slightly on one side, offering a sliver of protection. Mortar rounds walked closer. Another landed 20 yards left. The next would be on target. The crew, now under fire, forgot about careful chalking. It was pure survival instinct. Kelso, adrenaline overriding mechanics, slammed the Jeep into reverse, backed up a foot to take the slack out of the harness, then threw it back into first gear, revving the engine to its red line. The Jeep leaped forward like a whipped animal. The howitzer, jerked by the sudden force, broke its wheels free. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the howitzer would swing sideways and jackknife, crushing the men beside it. But Corporal Andretti, with insane bravery, ran alongside and kicked a wooden chalk under a sliding wheel, straightening its path. They careened into the shallow defile, just as the third mortar round impacted exactly where they had been stalled. The concussion shook the trees and rained snow down upon them, but the earth bank shielded them from the blast. They were safe for maybe 30 seconds, but now they faced an even more terrifying prospect. The defilade led onto a short, steep downgrade, maybe 50 yards long, at a 10-degree slope. Icy, unforgiving. Below that, the trail turned sharply left over a narrow, wooden bridge spanning a frozen creek, a bridge no one had inspected for weight limits. Captain Ford surveyed it, his face pale. "If we go down that slope, the gun will push us. We won't be able to stop. If we miss that turn, or if the bridge fails." He didn't need to finish. The image was clear. A Jeep and a Teuton howitzer plummeting into a frozen creek bed. A tangle of broken men and metal. They were pinned. Mortars behind them. An impassable slope ahead. The clock read 10:55. The bombardment was to begin in 5 minutes. From their hidden pocket, they could hear the opening stutter of machine gun fire from Hill 526. The American infantry was beginning its assault without their support. Sergeant Kelso felt a profound, chilling despair. They had tried. They had improvised. They had survived Morty, but physics and terrain had finally won. The gun was lost. He looked at Captain Ford, ready to receive the order to disable the piece. Captain Ford did not give the order. He was staring, not at the slope, but at the woods to its left. The trees were thinner there. It wasn't the trail, but it wasn't a thick forest either. It was a mix of young pines and bare hardwood, the ground covered in deep snow but seemingly less obstructed. "Forget the trail," Ford said suddenly, his voice cutting through the cold air and the distant gunfire. "We go cross-country, through the trees." "Sir," the snow Kelso began, "is deep, but it's powder on a frozen base. The jeep might float on it. The gun's wheels will cut through. It's a longer route, maybe 400 yards around to rejoin the trail past the bridge, but it bypasses the slope entirely. It's our only shot." It was a gambler's move. Off-road, the risk of hitting a hidden stump, a rock, or sinking into a frozen stream bed was enormous, but it was a risk of obstacles, not a certainty of gravity. They had to try. The crew, understanding the logic, moved with renewed, frantic energy. They used their entrenching tools to scrape away snow from the jeep-ass path for the first critical few yards. There was no time for more. Kelso aimed the jeep for the gap between two young pines and gunned it. What followed was a scene of surreal, brutal effort. The jeep, light and powered by all four wheels, did indeed float and skid across the surface of the snow, its tracks quickly becoming deep ruts. The howitzer, behind it, plowed through these ruts like a ship's prow through a white sea. The GOE was painfully slow, the engine a constant, agonized scream. Men pushed when the jeep stalled. They dug when the wheels spun. They threw their shoulders against the trail arm of the howitzer to help it turn. Every yard was a victory. Every minute that passed was a minute the infantry on Hill 526 fought without their support. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the gun. Branches scraped and snapped against the hood, the windshield, the barrel of the gun. At 11:10, they finally broke through the tree line, rejoining the main trail, 100 yards past the death slope and the fragile bridge. They were battered, exhausted, caked in snow and mud, but they were on firm ground, with a relatively straight, flat run of about 800 yards to the designated firing position, Alpha 7. But the jeep was dying. Smoke, thick and oily, began to pour from the engine compartment. The clutch was slipping badly, the smell of burning friction material filling the cab. The improvised harness was fraying, individual strands of the nylon webbing snapping with loud pings under the relentless strain. "It's not going to make it, sir," Kelso shouted over the engine dying wail. "It doesn't have to make it back," Ford yelled. "It just has to make it there. Don't stop. Even if it melts into the ground, don't stop." The final 800 yards was a funeral procession for a machine giving its last full measure. The jeep, now billowing smoke, moving in jarring, shuddering lurches as the clutch failed, dragged its colossal burden forward. The crew ran alongside, no longer just guides, but mourners and witnesses. At 11:23, with a final metallic shriek and a cloud of steam, the jeep's engine ceased utterly. It rolled to a dead stop, exactly 50 yards short of the prepared gun emplacement at Alpha 7. For a second, there was only the sound of hissing metal and panting men. They had failed, but Captain Ford was already out of the jeep. "The gun is not in position. We are push." It was the final, impossible demand. 8 exhausted men, fueled by rage, guilt, and a desperate love for their comrades on that bloody ridge, threw themselves against the howitzer. They pushed against the cold steel of the barrel, the trail, the wheels. They heaved. They roared. And inch by screaming inch, they moved the Teuton behemoth, the final 50 yards into its firing pit. At 11:27, 3 minutes after their jeep gave its life, gun number 4 was in position. The crew, moving with a speed born of years of drill, unlocked the trails, leveled the gun, and rammed home the first high-explosive shell. The Fire Direction Center, having lost all hope, received the radio call from a breathless Captain Ford. Gun 4, in position and ready for fire mission. The first round left the barrel at 11:31 hours. It was 26 minutes late, but it was on target. The remaining 3 guns of Battery B, already in position and having fired a few ranging shots, now joined gun number 4 in a full, concentrated bombardment. For 8 minutes, a storm of 105mm shells rained down on the German positions on Hill 526. The machine gun nests were silenced. The Pak-40 was destroyed when the infantry of the 23rd Armored Infantry Battalion stormed the ridge. At 11:45, they met disorganized, shell-shocked resistance. They took the objective with minimal casualties. The after-action report from the company commander noted specifically, artillery support, though initially delayed, was ultimately decisive and exceptionally accurate. The cost was high. The Jeep was a total loss. Its engine block had cracked. Its transmission was destroyed. Its chassis was warped from the strain of the improvised harness. It was stripped for parts and abandoned at position Alpha 7. The howitzer, however, served for the remainder of the campaign without issue. But the real legacy was human. Captain James H. Ford was awarded the Bronze Star for his resourceful leadership and steadfast determination in the face of imminent failure. Sergeant Frank Kelso and Corporal Leo Andretti each received the Army Commendation Medal for their technical ingenuity and personal bravery. The entire crew was cited for actions above and beyond the call of duty, yet the highest honor was unspoken. It was in the letters that did not have to be written to the families of the men on Hill 526. It was in the ridge that was taken, the line that advanced, and the momentum that was maintained. In the grand, mechanized sweep of World War II, this was a tiny incident. No generals plotted it. No textbooks would memorialize it. It was a problem solved by tired, cold men with straps and chains and courage. It proved a fundamental truth of war, that willpower and ingenuity can, for one critical moment, overcome the hard laws of physics and the cold mathematics of logistics. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps took unofficial note. While no manual was ever amended to recommend towing 105mm howitzers with jeeps, the story became legend in artillery battalions. It was a testament to the ethos of make it work. The jeep was already a symbol of American mobility. But on that frozen day near St. Vith, one jeep became a symbol of something more: impossible tenacity. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Stories not of famous battles, but of small victories. Not of legendary generals, but of sergeants, corporals, and captains who stared down impossible odds and simply refused to yield, as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.